A live look at satellite as the tropics still quite quiet through July as we now make our way into the third week of July. We're live here in your hurricane headquarters on Track in the Tropics, powered by Handyman Roofing, to let you know the very latest of what to expect and when things might pick up in the tropics. Hey there, folks. JB here with you live in your hurricane headquarters alongside Max Defender 8 Chief Meteorologist Jeff Baradelli in the top right-hand portion of your screen. Also joining us from ABC 27 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, meteorologist Addis Uklo is our featured meteorologist for today. Not too much to talk about as far as the current activity in the tropics, but the big question is, Jeff, when are things going to pick up? But let's send things over to you first to let us know exactly what's going on to our southeast.
Yeah, you know, that is a big question. When will things pick up? And it doesn't look like necessarily anytime very soon. There's some chance that we will see something form in the deep tropical Atlantic Ocean sometime next week. So we'll talk about that. So first, what you're looking at right now is the current view of the Gulf and the Caribbean. It is just, we call it severe clear in meteorology world, meaning there's nothing going on. It's really exceptionally quiet for this time of year. Now, I can't say that July is typically very active. It's not typically active. And so, you know, it's along the lines of what we would expect for climatology, although, you know, it's probably even quieter than it should be. Zooming out, as we head into the tropical Atlantic Ocean, there's nothing there either. So development not expected over the next 5 days. However, that may change again next week, and I'm gonna show you why. It's based on what's happening in Africa right now. In the meantime, across the Atlantic, looking at Saharan dust, not too much across the Gulf and the Caribbean. It's a lot still, and that is suppressing activity across the deep tropical Atlantic. We call it the MDR, the main development region. But there's some hints that that may lessen up a little bit next week, and at the same time, we're starting to see some activity in terms of tropical waves pick up in terms of the frequency off of Africa. Now, we're still in a kind of a negative climatological, cycle right now, short-term cycles that last, usually a few weeks or so. And that's what we're seeing across Africa. But that's going to switch a little bit in the Atlantic Ocean sometime next week. And at the same time, these waves will still come off of Africa. So there is some chance that we will see something form. Our American model is hinting at the possibility of maybe some modest formation out there. Our European model, not as much, but still, again, showing these pretty decent tropical waves, which have some potential for development. So we're going to run this computer model over the next 9 days, and you'll see that there's a lot of activity down there, and every once in a while, a little area low pressure tries to close off. Doesn't always succeed. This American model that I'm showing you has essentially a bunch of children, if you will. It's called an ensemble forecast, and many of the ensembles from this computer model, so this computer model has, I think, 25 ensembles. So essentially, we run the computer model 25 times, but with slightly different tweaked parameters. The ensemble does show a few of its members, at least show some development there. So that's why I say there's still some chance that it may happen next week. But right now, where the favorable phase of climate happens to be in the eastern Pacific Ocean, and we are seeing situations there. Tropical storm Estelle, and then also a 30% chance of development south of Puerto Vallarta. And we do think we'll see at least a couple to maybe a few more storms over the next week and a half or so in that general area. So that is where kind of this favorable climate phase is, which should shift into the Atlantic sometime next week. Won't be favorable for very long in the Atlantic, but maybe for a week or so, we have kind of an open window for the possibility of development. Now, if you've been watching, every week I show you where the favorable areas for development are. Earlier in the season, it was across the Gulf of Mexico, and then it shifted off the east coast of the United States, and now it's anywhere. Basically, anybody is game between July 20th and August 3rd. We're looking at the historical tropical systems from 1950 to 2021. And as we zoom out, you'll see they develop anywhere. So now we're starting to see a shift. We weren't seeing these over the past 2 weeks, but we're seeing now that, historically speaking, we see a lot more development starting to happen in the deep tropical Atlantic, way out there towards Africa, in between the Lesser Antilles and Africa. So we are behind the last 2 years. We're about on pace of average right now, but behind 2020 and 2021. So this year seems like such a quiet year, given that it's been so active for the past several years across the Atlantic basin. And I'll kind of end with this. Again, we are in July, as you can see, and the peak of hurricane season, September 10th. And I wouldn't start thinking, oh, it's going to be an active or inactive season until we get to like August 15th, because at that point, things really start to pick up. You can get 2 or 3 tropical systems at a time. So any thoughts of, well, it's a weak system, it's an inactive system, an inactive season, that really, you just can't make that call yet until we start seeing stuff ramp up in August.
Chief Meteorologist Jeff Biradelli here on Tracking the Tropics. Let's bring in our featured meteorologist today, Addis Uklo, joining us again from ABC 27 up there in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. First and foremost, Addis, great to have you back on the program. Hope you're doing well. What do you make of the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season so far? As we noted that you just had there from Jeff, a few named storms so far this year, not as active as seasons in recent memory.
Yeah, thanks for having me, JB. It's good to be here. And yeah, it's certainly a quiet start to the season, perhaps a little more quiet than a lot of us expected, which is not necessarily a bad thing. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and all the other major groups that do forecast for the hurricane season do still expect above average activity this year. So just because we're quiet through July does not necessarily mean anything about the rest of the season. And typically, to get an active period in the hurricane season, much like a lot of other kinds of severe weather, you need the conditions or the ingredients to overlap, to be there. And we just haven't seen that yet. We've seen the Saharan dust layer over the Atlantic Ocean. That's helped to suppress some of the activity. And we're just not in that favorable time of year yet that the global weather patterns kind of line up and allow for the development of these storms to move in all the way from the Atlantic and closer home. So the bad news is the Gulf of Mexico remains very warm. Sea surface temperatures are warmer than average, and there is no sign of that stopping. So once we do see those conditions come together here, if not over the next week, perhaps by mid-August, as those storms move over that warm water and as we head throughout the season and we see less wind shear, that's when we have to be certainly on guard. And not to mention, too, that La Nina looks like will continue throughout the rest of hurricane season. And remember, a La Nina is more favorable for hurricanes because that means less wind shear over the Atlantic Ocean. So at this point, it's just kind of a wait and see. And even though it has been quiet so far, we certainly still expect that once hurricane season wakes up, that we are going to have probably numerous storms to track, and there's the potential that those storms could turn strong very quickly.
Addis Uklo again joining us from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Jeff, I don't know about you, but when I see that graphic, I think of a roller coaster, and just like a roller coaster, it's like that moment right before you're going to have that rapid, in this case, it would be ascent, but descent. Yeah. It's that moment of anxiety that you have because hurricane season.
The calm before the storm, right?
Right. So when do we expect things to really start to pick up? I mean, August is really where it is, right?
Oftentimes we say, well, it starts to ramp up the beginning of August, but the truth is it really starts to ramp up the middle of August, and things can change in a heartbeat. You can go from a very quiet season to bang, everything's just starting to fire off. What a lot of the real tropical experts are contemplating right now is it's been really active in the tropical Pacific Ocean, and that is not very typical of a La Nina. Now, it's possible, at least in my mind, and Addis, you can chime in on this, the coolest water in the Pacific Ocean is not necessarily focused on the East Pacific. It's a little bit more so Central Pacific, so it may just be the location of the La Nina. Addis, we did an analysis here at WFLA on the last 30 to 40 years of La Ninas versus El Niños. Exact same number of El Nino years, exact same number of La Nina years. And it turns out that La Nina has almost exactly 3 times the number of hurricanes than El Nino years. So, and as you mentioned, La Nina is likely to continue. In fact, the latest forecast came out a couple days ago, and there's something like a 70% chance that La Nina will continue through the heart of hurricane season. And not only that, it's a pretty moderate to, some people would say it's a strong La Nina right now, some of the indices. So I think there's a lot of confusion, not confusion, but just a lot of experts that are like scratching their heads saying, wait a second, why isn't this happening? Why isn't it kind of showing signs of at least fits and starts? And it really hasn't shown that. I mean, even the systems that we had earlier this year, they were potential tropical cyclones for like 50 days before, I'm exaggerating, it was like 3 or 4 days before they became named tropical systems. So there's a problem that we're having a problem diagnosing. And it may just be, and Addis knows what I'm talking about when I talk about the tropical weather pattern that is like a 2 or 3 week pattern. I'm talking about the Madden-Julian oscillation. It seems like there's a lack of robust climate parameters that are making their way from the Pacific into the Atlantic Ocean to get these things going. You can't just have warm surface, sea surface temperatures like Addis was talking about. Everything needs to line up. And the one thing that hasn't been lining up very well is we haven't seen these 2 or 3 week periods, these climate patterns that generally move from the Pacific into the Atlantic Ocean. They haven't been lining up very well, and they haven't been very robust, actually, as well. And that's something that it's really hard to tell looking ahead for the next 3 weeks, how, or even longer, how those are going to pan out, because there's a lot of dissension in the computer model ranks as to, what's going to happen. The European says one thing, the American says another. So it's really very kind of gray right now, I'd say.
Yeah, I would agree. And like you said, the MJO, or the Madden-Julian oscillation, just has not been all that robust so far this season. It's been very weak. So we have not seen that upper level configuration that is conducive for hurricane development in the Atlantic. I was looking at some forecasts that suggest the Madden-Julian oscillation is going to start to strengthen a little bit as we head over the coming days. And it's going to go, as we call, into phase 1. And all the phases mean is just where the convection associated with the MJO is going to be. And research has found that when the MJO heads into phases 1 and 2, or as we call is west-based, then that's when we start to see things line up more. So that's why I've even read myself some of the hurricane experts on social media and on various platforms saying that, even as early as perhaps the end of next week, if that MJO comes into configuration, we should start to see the environment come together. But also, in addition to the MJO and the global pattern, we have to wait for that Saharan dust to scour out, because that only prevents the things from forming further because of drier and intrusion into hurricanes and tropical systems, as well as an increase in wind shear. So yeah, things just not lining up yet. It does look like there's potential next week, but right now still not a slam dunk.
May I ask a question? Something you said, Jeff, that was very fascinating to me. So if what I'm understanding is correct, you're talking about the American and European models not agreeing. That's the GFS and the Euro. Are they just not in sync? Is that abnormal for this time of year?
Basically what we need to figure out is and he was talking about the upper levels, right? So we're looking at the upper levels, and for areas where there's something called diffluence, essentially where the air is spreading outward and allowing air to rise under it. So that's the only way to really get air to rise, is there to be a way for it to breathe out. It's like inhaling in and then exhaling out. If the storm cannot exhale on the top end, then, or if the atmosphere can't, then it tends to be a less favorable area for development. So the computer models are kind of disagreeing on whether or not there's going to be that favorable exhaling, if you will, in the upper part of the atmosphere over places like Africa, where a lot of these seedlings come from, not just Africa, but across the Atlantic basin as well. So I don't know if the computer models are coming into better agreement. I've been looking at them constantly every day, and it's such a weak signal, and I think Addis mentioned this, that it really is hard to make heads or tails yet out of exactly when the pattern's going to kick in. But as Addis said, even if an MJO cycle kicks into favorable phase for the Atlantic Ocean, you need other things to line up, and one of those things is we still have a lot of Saharan dust. So what he's talking about specifically is what I was talking about, which the middle of next week in the deep tropical Atlantic Ocean, we're going to have some pretty good waves that come off of Africa. The MJO will be in a semi-favorable phase, so that bodes well for possible tropical development, but at the same time, there looks to be possibly some drier intrusion coming in from up north. So it's not yet really that climatologically favorable yet. If this were mid-August, I'd say, this has a really good chance. But we're still in that time of year when these systems, it's fits and starts, and they kind of struggle, and they show that they may develop, but then they don't end up developing.
Which is so interesting to me, just because we have had, in the last couple of years, we have had June and July storms of note to some extent. Nothing significantly, massively major, but at least we've been, of course, racing through the alphabet more at a quicker pace in recent years.
Yeah, and again, I think there were more favorable MJO situations last year in terms of everything lining up. Something's a little odd this year. The fact that the Eastern Pacific is so, active right now does not bode well for Atlantic activity. It bodes well for us, though, because we don't want Atlantic activity, right?
Yep.
But as soon as the Eastern tropical Pacific starts to quiet down, then you really start to worry, because there's got to be rising air somewhere. There's got to be storms firing up somewhere in the tropics. And if they're not firing up in the Eastern Pacific, then likely it's the Atlantic that becomes active. So that's something that we'll be looking for over the next few weeks.
Addis, before we let you go, before we start to wrap up this edition of Tracking the Tropics, what are you going to be watching in the days and weeks ahead as we get closer to, as we noted, this roller coaster type of line graph as we see this ascent occurring in August into September?
Yeah, it's just amazing to me. And I always want to make the point of how drastic that change is. That line almost goes vertical in August. So it really is amazing the difference that we see on average in July compared to late August and especially September. So we're going to be watching for all these things over the coming weeks. We're going to be watching satellite trends to see if that dry layer of air, that's hair and dust, is starting to move out at all. We're going to be watching for the global weather pattern to come together. We know things are going to turn active. It's more just a question of when. So these are all indices that we're going to have to track over the coming days. And, La Nina is not going anywhere anytime soon. And, it looks like we could even have a La Nina that lingers right through the winter time. And by the way, it's only happened, I believe, twice since 1950 that we have had 3 straight La Nina winters in a row. So this is a pretty unique situation climatologically that we have a La Nina linger for so long, but hopefully things start to switch by next season and perhaps we enter more of a neutral phase or even an El Nino. We can tend to see a little more suppressed tropical activity. But as we always say, just because it's quiet right now doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. So we need to be on guard not only through August and September, but right through the end of October and early November, because we do expect things to wake up.
Yeah, and what's interesting about what he said is, it would be good tropically for the Atlantic Ocean if we do go back into an El Nino next year, because as we talked about, we see a lot less hurricanes during El Nino. Wouldn't necessarily be great for the globe because even in this La Nina year where it's really, really cold across the tropical Pacific Ocean, relatively speaking, we're still very close to seeing these monthly record hot temperatures across the globe. I think this past month we were like the 6th warmest record, which is tough to do in a La Nina when it's so cold in the tropical Pacific Ocean. But the moment we switch over to an El Nino, all of a sudden now we are going to start seeing the hottest years globally. That's generally when we see them. So as soon as that happens, we're likely to start seeing that. And in those years, we tend to see heat waves like we saw in the UK yesterday, except they'll be even stronger and even more robust and more intense. So I am interested to see this next El Nino if it tends to be a really, really strong El Nino because it's just, because the pattern switches and all of a sudden now we're in a super El Nino. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but when it does, it's going to cause a lot of extreme weather around the world.
And to sum it up, folks, stay tuned because, again, the beef of hurricane season, the peak of hurricane season, expected in the weeks ahead in that August and September ramp up that you see in the center of your screen. Tracking the Tropics, powered by Handyman Roofing, is live every Wednesday over the course of hurricane season, 2 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Central, on whatever app, website, or social media platform that you're watching on. We tap into Next Star Nation's just invaluable resource of all the meteorologists that we have across the country, like Addis Uklo, joining us from ABC 27. Addis, it's been great to have you on this edition. Addis, is this your 3rd or 4th year on Tracking the Tropics? I'm trying to remember now.
I think this is my 3rd year now. It's my first time on this year. So yeah, it's good to be back. And obviously I hope to be back again in the future, but I also hope that we don't see major hurricanes making landfall and that we don't have to do more special coverage. But it's good to be here, and I thank you guys for inviting me back as always.
Likewise, my friend. It's great to see you as always. I'm sure we'll be seeing you later on in the season. For Addis, Jeff, I'm JB. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time, folks, on Tracking the Tropics.
Thank you for watching Tracking the Tropics.